The technique that used to fill stringers now sits in the bottom of tackle boxes nobody opens. The Carolina rig, the split shot setup, the slow-rolled spinnerbait, the buzzbait at first light. These things didn't stop working when forward-facing sonar showed up on social media feeds. Bass didn't read the press release. What happened is simpler and more interesting. The market moved, the content moved, and anglers followed the content instead of the fish. But here's what that created: a pool of lures and presentations that bass in heavily fished public water have seen far less of, which means they carry something new which don't have yet. No learned pressure. This video covers 10 techniques that got pushed to the back of the conversation, why each one still works on a biological level, and exactly when and where to use each one from the bank. The first spot where forgotten techniques show up is exactly where you'd least expect to need them: water that gets hit every weekend. When you fish the same public bank that 100 other people hit with the same drop shot and the same shaky head, you're not competing with the fish's instincts anymore. You're competing with the fish's memory. And the evidence that memory matters shows up in the data. Shoup and Lane's 2015 research documented that as angling pressure increases on a given body of water, largemouth bass begin to show clear avoidance behavior toward high-frequency lure presentations they encounter repeatedly. The lures those bass haven't seen in 2 seasons. They look like food again. That single shift in thinking is the unlock for everything that follows. There are 10 techniques in this video. By the time you get through them, you'll have a clear picture of which conditions each one fits, what the bass is responding to on a sensory level each time, and why the fact that your fishing partners stopped throwing these things is actually an argument for picking them back up. The first technique is the Carolina rig, and the reason it belongs at the top of this list is not nostalgia. It belongs here because of what it does to the bottom that no other rig replicates. When you drag a Carolina rig, the heavy weight contacts the bottom and produces a sequence of sounds: the sinker grinding over substrate, the glass beads clacking against each other, that outdoor life described in a 2025 technical breakdown as sounding similar to a crawfish scurrying across rock. That noise triggers what biologists call intercept behavior. The bass investigates the disturbance source and arrives to find a soft plastic trailer drifting naturally 2 feet behind it. The Carolina rig's effective depth window runs from 5 to 40 feet, with the 15 to 25-foot range producing most consistently on offshore humps, channel swings, and deep flat transitions. The mistake most anglers make when they do throw it is using too light a weight. You need enough mass to feel the bottom content changing beneath you. Sand to gravel, gravel to clay. Because that transition is where bass stage. Anything under 3/4 of an ounce in water deeper than 12 feet is guessing. The test: drag slowly, stop, count to 4. Drag again. If you feel resistance at a point that wasn't there on the previous cast, you hit structure. Fish it. The second technique is the split shot rig, and it fills a gap the Carolina rig can't reach. Wired 2 Fish published a breakdown by Elite Series pro Terry Scroggins, where he described the split shot as the bait he reaches for specifically on post-frontal days and heavily pressured water, citing its ability to skip under docks and produce bites from fish that have ignored everything else. The key mechanic is the fall. Scroggins is explicit about this. If the bass doesn't take the bait on the drop, working it further is usually a losing proposition. The action is in the free fall, and the distance between the split shot weight and the hook, typically 12 to 36 inches, controls how slowly that fall happens. Lighter shot, longer leader, slower fall. Use this in clear water with pressured fish. Heavier shot, tighter leader, faster fall. Use this to skip past panfish and get the presentation in front of a base-size target fast. From the bank, the split shot shines at isolated pieces of wood, a stump, a laydown, a dock post, where you can cast beyond the target and let the bait fall through the strike zone on the way past. The third technique is slow rolling a spinnerbait, and it addresses something the market never gave the spinnerbait credit for. Outdoor Life ran a 2026 feature pointing out that the spinnerbait triggers two independent sensory systems at once. The blade flash activates the bass's visual tracking system, while the blade rotation produces a pressure wave detected by the lateral line. The lateral line, documented in Science Direct's fish sensory physiology entries, runs the length of the fish's body and detects displacement and vibration without requiring any visual input. In stained or murky water, when vision becomes unreliable, the lateral line carries the full detection load. A Colorado blade running at a slow retrieve through that water isn't just a lure, it's an auditory beacon. The test for the right speed: the blade should barely tick rather than spin freely. If you can feel the thump on your rod tip with each rotation, you're in the productive speed range. From the bank, work it parallel to the shoreline rather than casting perpendicular, which keeps the presentation in the productive zone longer. The fourth technique is flipping and pitching to visible cover. This presentation was the foundation of professional bass fishing for decades before finesse tactics took the spotlight, and Bassmasters archives document tournament wins built entirely on a jig dropped to dock posts, brush piles, and fallen timber. The reason this works has never changed. Largemouth basses use ambush structure as a waiting position between feeding movements, and a presentation that drops directly into that position skips the tracking phase entirely. The fish doesn't have to chase. It only has to close its mouth. The common mistake from the bank is fishing only the nearest cover, the stuff everyone can reach. The productive targets are typically 10 to 15 feet farther, behind the first laydown. Under the dock section, nobody reaches without a careful sidearm pitch. That extra distance means less pressure, and less pressure means more bites. The fifth technique is dead sticking a plastic worm on a split shot. Cast it to a target, let it settle, and leave it. Guidesley's winter bass reference describes the logic directly. Bass in post-frontal or cold water conditions will cruise structure and pick up stationary prey because a dead or dying target is the lowest energy meal available. A bait that does nothing is not a bait that looks unnatural. It looks like easy food. In water below 60 degrees, or in the 12 hours after a cold front passes, leave the worm on the bottom for a full 60-second count without moving it. If nothing happens, move to a new piece of cover rather than adding action to the same spot. The sixth technique is the buzzbait at first light. The Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission identifies the dawn and dusk surface pattern as one of the most reliable largemouth feeding windows, citing the absence of direct sun on the water and the calm surface conditions that make this window unique. Bass at first light in the shallows have a vision advantage. They can track targets up into the brighter surface zone while remaining in the darker water below. A buzzbait at steady retrieve creates a disturbance on two channels simultaneously: blade noise and surface pressure. The window is roughly 30 minutes before sunrise through 90 minutes after. From the bank, work it parallel to banks, across weed edges, and along dock lines. If a bass blows up and misses, keep the retrieve going at the same speed. A follow that didn't commit often converts when the bait maintains its cadence. The seventh technique is the topwater popper with long pauses. Oklahoma Department of Wildlife Conservation's Base Resources note that bass prefer the back of coves and creek arms for surface attacks in low light. The popper's concave face creates a splash that reads like a struggling baitfish, but the decision to strike usually happens in the pause that follows. Post-spawn or pressured fish that follow and turn away from a walking bait often commit to a popper because the stationary moment eliminates the forward momentum that triggers a refusal. Cast past your target, let the rings dissipate completely, pop once, and then wait 10 full seconds before the next pop. That interval will feel uncomfortably slow. It is usually the right tempo. The 8th technique is dragging a football jig across hard bottom. Major League Fishing's technique documentation identifies the football jig head shape as designed specifically to prevent tipping on contact with bottom, which keeps the profile presenting correctly through the retrieve. The retrieve is drag and pause. Never hop. Hopping lifts the jig off the bottom contact that makes it effective. From the bank, find where hard bottom transitions to soft. That edge is where bass hold on offshore structure. Make long casts at different angles and feel for where the resistance changes on the drag. When the grind goes to glide, that transition is the target. The 9th technique is live night crawlers under a slip float, drifted along a shoreline contour. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's documentation of largemouth bass feeding biology is direct. Adult largemouth feed primarily on fish, crawfish, and aquatic worms. A live night crawler produces scent, movement, and natural profile in a combination no soft plastic replicates. Bass Resource notes that fish ignoring plastic presentations consistently find live bait harder to refuse. The slip float controls depth and allows wind to carry the bait along contours you can't reach with a direct cast. Position yourself where the wind will push the float parallel to structure rather than away from it. The 10th technique is the wacky-rigged stickworm near post-spawn flats. Kayak Angler magazine describes the rig's slow horizontal sink, with both ends waving simultaneously, as the element that makes recovering post-spawn bass commit when other presentations don't. Post-spawn fish are not feeding at full metabolism, which means reaction bites are rare. The wacky rig doesn't ask for a reaction bite. It presents a slow, vulnerable target that the fish can close on without effort. Cast to the far edge of the flat, let the rig sink without any line management, and watch for the line to jump or go slack before the bait reaches bottom. A bass that takes a wacky rig on the fall rarely announces itself loudly. Now, here is what ties all 10 of these together, and it reframes every technique on the list. Every one of these presentations is slower than the average retrieve on a high-traffic bank on a Saturday morning. That is not a coincidence. The Shoup and Lane 2015 research documented that largemouth under sustained angling pressure shift toward more opportunistic prey selection, consistent with fish that are no longer tracking targets visually, but responding to different signals at closer range. Fast presentations that show up constantly on pressured water start to get filtered out the way background noise gets filtered. Slow presentations that don't show up as often still look like food. The single most transferable principle from this list: slow down by 30% from whatever feels right. If the split shot felt slow, go slower. If the Carolina rig drag felt deliberate, add 2 more counts to every pause. The bass are not waiting for something exciting. They are waiting for something that looks like a meal. If this kind of content is useful to you, techniques, the biology behind them, and clear field tests. Subscribing is how you make sure the next one shows up. The thread connecting all 10 presentations is not nostalgia. It is this: bass respond to stimuli that trigger feeding behavior, and those stimuli are defined by biology that has not changed. Before your next trip to a pressured bank, think about which technique you haven't thrown in 2 seasons. That is probably the one worth tying on first.